we talk about the role of religion in extremism, it's very important to go back to the time of the Prophet and see what he has to say about this. So when you go back to his time, we find that there was a particular case where three men had committed themselves to not getting married, to fasting day and night, and to praying day and night without taking any breaks. And when the Prophet, peace be upon him, found out about this, his natural reaction was that anyone that goes to an extreme in his religion will be destroyed. And what he meant by that is that you can't retain religion while having extremist view of it. So now, why do people go to extremes in religion? And a lot of the times what ends up happening is they have a guilt inside of them where they need that redemption. So they feel that they've been leading lives of sin this whole entire time, and the only way they can redeem themselves is if they do this great, grandiose gesture of commitment to God. And that sort of ties into like suicide bombings, right? Like, how do people get tied into suicide bombings? One of the things that leads them into that is that need for redemption in front of God. They feel that if they sacrifice their lives for God, then hopefully God will forgive them. So that's more from a religious perspective. Now, from a sociological perspective, if you look at extremism and how it gets tied into religion, a lot of the times people come with their own baggage. And what I mean by that, they might have a background of criminality where they were a part of a gang, or they come from a home that was broken down, right? Perhaps the dad is not present, or there's some sort of domestic violence at home, or maybe in school they were bullied. So all these dynamics coming together, they come with this background that isn't, relatively stable. So now as they find their religious identity with that baggage that they're already coming with, they naturally go towards a very narrow point of view. And this is what we would call like religious exclusivity. So I'm right and you're wrong, and I don't want to listen to what you have to say. And the more narrow this gets, the more the other party becomes ostracized, and they become the other, and the more they're willing to do, bad things to them. So this ties into the ISIS narrative itself, that they do a great job of painting the other, that they're not from us, and therefore we're justified in doing anything and everything to them. And the way that they do this is we are right and they're wrong. And as long as we're on the right, we can do anything because we will be saved at the end of the day for being right. Now, when you look at this religious identity and the role religious knowledge plays, this is a crisis that is happening within ISIS itself. So they've been looking for religious scholars for validation. But the natural reaction is that anyone that has religious knowledge is not going to validate what ISIS stands for. So you have their mufti, their grand edict giver, Abu Sufyan al-Sulami, also known as Turki bin Ali, and possibly Abu Bakr al-Naji, and multiple other names. He's a very young individual that loved Islamic knowledge. But the reality is he wanted to go and study. He didn't find too many opportunities. And eventually he gets caught up in this nonsense. Now, why he's such a key figure is because they couldn't find bigger, individuals. And what I mean by bigger is more well-known, reputable scholars to become their representatives from a religious perspective. They're left with someone like Turki bin Ali. And this ties in greatly to the role of religion. And the way that ties in is we would find a recurring theme in Westerners that have gone to join ISIS. None of them had any form of religious accreditation. They hadn't studied in any form of religious universities, nor had they dedicated a large amount of time to studying the religion themselves. Either some of them are converts, or either were freshly finding their religious identity, or some of them, they had been Muslim for a while, but they had no background in religion itself. And that is why you see them doing these silly things like buying the Quran for dummies, or the ABCs of the Arabic language, and things like that, because they had no background in religion. So the concluding part to this is that religion is going to play a huge role in solving this crisis, and that the more people learn about their religion and the role that religion plays in giving sanctity to human life, the less likely they are to take it in the name of religion unjustly. So religion definitely needs to be tied into the equation of solving this extremism. One of the questions I get asked frequently is that can radicalization actually be prevented? And can we actually stop our youth from traveling overseas to join these extremist groups? Now, without a shadow of a doubt, I'm a firm believer that we actually can. And the approach that we need to take needs to be a very holistic approach. By holistic approach, I mean their social services needs to be involved, the family of the individual needs to be involved, the religious leader in the community needs to be involved, and we need to see what other support system, this particular individual may need. But that is like the absolute core that definitely should be there. Now, I want to share a very personal experience with you. In one of my trips to Australia, there was a young individual. He was of Afghani origin, and he came and spoke to me during the conference. I just thought, he was a regular individual. I didn't see anything unique about him. But he had a lot of built-up frustration about what was going on in the world, particularly in his own country, in Afghanistan, and particularly in Iraq at that time as well. And he's like, look, I really want to help the Muslim Ummah out, or the Muslim nation out. What can we do? And then he starts talking about ISIS and why he wants to join ISIS. And I sat down with him, and I think we must have spoken for a good couple of hours. And eventually we came to the conclusion that, look, these extremist groups, they love recruiting people, and they use the Westerners as the front of the line, and they send them right away to get destroyed. So that's one thing that you need to keep in mind. The second thing you need to keep in mind is that look at these extremist groups, one after another, to go from Al-Qaeda to ISIS to Boko Haram or whatever, and what good are they actually doing in the world? Like, have they changed anything for the better? And the reality is, no, they haven't. They've actually made things worse, not only for the Muslim community, where we've come under a lot of scrutiny now, but also in the world in general, that everyone's living in fear and everyone's always constantly scared. You go to the airport, you got to wait like hours and hours in line, and there's just it's an absolute nightmare. So they haven't done anything good. And then the third thing we want to look at is, let's look at the narrative that these groups are actually providing. And it's very negative, it's very pessimistic. It's all, apocalypse based, that the end of times are coming and this great battle is going to take place between good and evil, and we're the side of good. And then when you question this narrative, hey, if you're the side of good, why are you killing people? Why are you stealing things? Why are you raping women? Why are you taking them as sex slaves and all of these things? And they don't have an answer for it. And then the biggest thing I remember talking about is that why is it that these groups are not supported by any mainstream religious scholars? In fact, all mainstream religious scholars take a very firm stance against these groups. And then at that time, I can't remember, I think I had to go to my lecture, I had to leave, but I didn't end up seeing him later on. I met him the next day, and I asked him, is everything okay? He said, yeah, everything was great. I asked him, did he have any more questions? And he said, you know what, I think there's a couple of things that we want to speak about. And we ended up speaking about his family and, what he wanted to do in life, but nothing related to religion. So I eventually left Australia. I came back home to Canada. And I think probably about a year, maybe even more than that, went by till this individual looked me up on Facebook. And he sent me a private message. And he's like, look, I just want to say thank you. And I'm like, for what? And he's like, you probably don't remember me, but I was the young kid that came and spoke to you after the conference. And I spoke to you about ISIS and joining ISIS. And if it wasn't for you, I think I probably would have joined ISIS and I could have been dead by now. So I just wanted to say thank you for that. And in that situation, sort of validifies not only my role in the community as a religious figure, but I feel that, together, if we start preventing these things from taking place rather than taking a reactionary role, this definitely can be prevented. So what is the missing component in preventing radicalization and helping our youth from getting involved in these problems? So I think a lot of times people talk about the sociological issues and the psychological issues and the religious issues that people have. But a lot of the times we end up ignoring the role of foreign policy. And what I want to mention over here is that if you look at Muslims in Canada in particular, the very first mosque was built in Alberta around 1938, 1939, around that time. So that shows that they've been here longer than that. And some records show late 1800s, early 1900s, that's when they actually arrived. So they've been here close to 100 years, even maybe a bit more than that. They've been here for a very long time. Why is it in 2006, when we had the Toronto 18 case, that we've had our first case of homegrown terrorism and the first thought of people traveling overseas to join these extremist groups? What was that missing component and that missing link? And I believe that missing link and component is for Western foreign policy, that the more Western countries invaded foreign lands, the more these Western countries become susceptible to homegrown radicalization and terrorism. Like, we should be asking ourselves that why is it that, ISIS is not threatening countries like Japan or, Thailand or these sort of countries? Like, why are they not under threat like the West is? And a lot of that has to do with Western foreign policy. So I think the more we adjust our foreign policy to not bombing and not invading and not taking resources and not even putting dictators in play and letting them live their own lives, the more likely we will be able to prevent this issue of radicalization in the Western worlds. Now, the role of religion is very important as well. People, particularly Muslims, have a very strong affiliation with their faith. Like, when you look at other faiths, you notice that generally they're dying down. Like the church is not as full as it used to be on Sundays, and other religions that are present, they're having a crisis of faith. With Muslims, those that were born into Islam are having a crisis of faith, but those that are embracing Islam, they're coming in flocks and herds to the mosque, and the mosque is like overflowed. Like if you look at our Friday prayers, we have a huge, problem where we started off with one Friday prayer, it wasn't enough, so we needed a second one. Now we're even thinking about getting a third and fourth, and some prayer spaces in Calgary even have up to 5, Friday services. So the community is growing, and there is a demand. Now, the role of religion has to be that they are able to speak about what's on their mind and be open about it, and the religious leaders need to be frank in having this discussion. So a lot of times religious leaders, they hide from speaking about what's on their mind and how they actually feel, because they know that, hey, if I say something and even mention the word jihad, even though I believe it's to be nothing related to terrorism, I'm going to come under scrutiny not only from my board of directors, but CIS is going to start surveying my mosque. And you know what, informants are going to be coming to my mosque, and I potentially could lose my job now. So they're very scared to speak about these very sensitive issues. And now when they become scared and youth have these questions, where are they going to go? They're going to go online. And that's when they get exposed to people like Anwar Awlaki and other extremist preachers that are out there. And that's when they develop a very, very religiously exclusive narrative for themselves and for their friends. Then they start looking online, hey, who else has this type of frame of mind? They go onto Twitter, go onto Snapchat, go onto Telegram, and that's when they develop these networks, and that's how the recruiting actually takes place. So now, if religious leaders had the freedom to speak their minds, and they were able to openly speak about the issues of jihad and the issues of, what is the basis of interaction with non-believers, and how it's one of peace and one of security and one of fulfilling contracts, I believe this could do a great deal of damage to the ISIS narrative that is based on the exact opposite, where they say the foundational interaction between a Muslim and non-Muslim is one of killing and one of thievery and so on and so forth. So religious leaders need that freedom. And then the third thing I would mention is the role of just feeling marginalized and Islamophobia. The more Muslims feel threatened, the more likely they are to fight back. Now, why is this narrative coming into play? Because we have bigots from the extreme right and from, I'm not sure if I'm allowed mentioning names, so I'm not going to mention names, but you just look at south of the border, what's happening in the presidential race. They're openly saying that Muslims need to be banned and we need to build walls, and, we're going to put them in these, we're going to monitor their neighborhoods. And it's just crazy. Like, this is literally, we're reliving prior World War II. Literally, that's what's happening right now. And it's absolutely mental. So that sort of reaction, needs to be mitigated, and that sort of rhetoric needs to be stopped, because that just feeds into the ISIS narrative that they say, hey, the West hates you, and these people are feeding into that ISIS narrative. So those are like the three things I would mention, is that relooking and assessing our foreign policy and making it one of helping and supporting what's happening on the ground, rather than going in and taking resources and putting dictators in play or putting leaders in play. Number two is that religious leaders need to be given the freedom to express themselves and not fear being ostracized by the Board of Trustees, nor by government security services or intelligence services. And then the third thing is mitigating Islamophobia and mitigating just this feeling of alienation, because together we are all a part of the solution. It's not about, me and you, that ISIS is going to differentiate in the West. But when ISIS comes to attack the West, they're going to kill both you and I. So you and I both need to work together, and everyone needs to be on the same page in countering radicalization. And everyone needs to play their role. Government should not be playing the role of religion. Religion shouldn't be getting to the role of government, but everyone should be doing their own part to the best of their ability.